I remember the hall vividly, though it's been decades since I last walked its creaking wooden floors. The quarantine hospital was a cold, dark place, a converted warehouse that once held grain and tools, now filled with the sick and dying. They called it the Hall of Shadows, a fitting name for what we endured there. My name is Dr. Samuel Whitaker, and this is the story of the worst days of my life, and perhaps my finest hours. It was the winter of 1875 when the smallpox epidemic struck our town. The disease came without warning, creeping into homes, striking down the young and old alike. Within weeks, the local hospital overflowed. The city council commandeered the old warehouse on the edge of town, and I was assigned to oversee the emergency efforts there. I was young then, fresh out of medical school, still clinging to the hope that science could triumph over anything. That hope would be tested in ways I could never have imagined. When I arrived at the quarantine station, the air was already thick with the smell of sickness, antiseptic, sweat, and despair. Rows of cots stretched endlessly before me, each one occupied by a patient in various stages of the disease. Their faces were marked with angry red pustules, their bodies racked with fever. The sound of coughing and moaning echoed through the cavernous space. It was overwhelming, but I had no time to falter. "Nurse O'Malley," I called out, spotting a woman in a starched white apron moving briskly among the patients. "Where do we begin?" She turned to me, her expression calm but weary. Margaret O'Malley was the backbone of that hospital, a woman of unshakable resolve. "We begin at the first bed, doctor," she said simply. "And we don't stop." And so I plunged into the chaos. Each patient was a story unto themselves, a young mother clutching her infant, both feverish and weak, a dock worker with calloused hands and pleading eyes, an elderly man who whispered prayers as I examined him. I did what I could, administering tinctures to ease their pain, cleaning their wounds, offering words of comfort. But I knew, even then, that many of them would not survive. One case haunts me to this day. A young boy, no older than 8, lay on a cot near the center of the hall. His face was swollen with pustules, his breaths shallow and labored. Beside him sat his mother, her own face marked by the disease but still filled with fierce determination. "Please, doctor," she begged as I approached, "save my boy." I examined him carefully, my heart sinking as I saw how far the disease had progressed. His fever was dangerously high, and his body was too small to endure much more. I gave him laudanum to ease his suffering and instructed the nurses to keep him hydrated. As I walked away, I felt the weight of the mother's gaze on my back. She didn't speak again, but her silence was louder than any plea. The boy didn't survive the night. I was with him when he took his last breath, his tiny hand clutching his mother's even as the life left his body. She didn't cry, at least not then. She simply kissed his forehead and whispered, "Rest now, my darling." It was one of the most heart-wrenching moments of my career. Not every story ended in tragedy. Some, against all odds, found their way back to life. I remember an elderly woman who had been brought in during the first wave of the epidemic. She was frail, her body ravaged by age and disease, but her spirit was unyielding. "Doctor," she said one morning, her voice barely more than a whisper, "do you believe in miracles?" I didn't know how to answer her. I believed in science, in medicine, in the power of human resilience. But miracles? That seemed beyond my realm. Still I nodded. "I believe in you," I said. And somehow she pulled through. Day by day, her strength returned. By the time she left the hospital, she was walking unassisted, a testament to the unyielding will to live. She smiled at me as she stepped out into the sunlight, and in that moment, I allowed myself a glimmer of hope. If I was the mind of the operation, Margaret O'Malley was its heart. She had seen more death than any person should endure, yet she never wavered. One night, as we worked side by side cleaning the wounds of a young sailor, I asked her how she managed to stay so strong. "I lost my family to this disease," she said, her voice steady. "My husband, my 2 daughters. This is all I have left, to help others. If I stop, I don't know who I am anymore." Her words stayed with me. We were all fighting our own battles, even as we worked to save others. The Hall of Shadows didn't just house the sick, it held our fears, our grief, and our determination to make a difference. By spring, the epidemic began to wane. The cots emptied one by one, either because their occupants recovered or because they didn't. The city slowly returned to life, but the scars of the epidemic remained. For those of us who had worked in the quarantine hospital, the experience left an indelible mark. I had come to understand the limits of medicine, but also its power. I had seen death, but also resilience. The warehouse was eventually torn down, its role in the epidemic forgotten by the next generation. But I remember. I remember the faces of the patients, the tireless efforts of the staff, the moments of triumph and despair. The Hall of Shadows was a place of suffering, yes, but it was also a place of humanity. Even now, as an old man reflecting on a life spent in medicine, I carry the lessons of that time with me. We are fragile creatures, vulnerable to forces beyond our control, but we are also strong, capable of extraordinary acts of compassion and courage. And that, I think, is what truly defines us.